Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee. And we want to welcome you all to yet another special episode in honor of the upcoming holiday, Christmas. Around this time, kids are generally on their best behavior and eagerly awaiting the long-anticipated ride of a jolly old gift giver across the night sky on December 24th. However, hundreds of years ago, this was not the case. For on those cold, dark winter nights for the Germanic peoples, when they had reached their darkest point and the veil between the land of the living and the dead had reached its thinnest, loosing the denizens of Helheim upon Midgard, another night rider was about to take off. However, his night ride was not eagerly anticipated, for although the howling winds coming over the mountains and rushing through the piney forest foretold of the coming of the Allfather Odin, who rode upon his eight-legged steed Sleipnir, it was not much cause for celebration. Rather, it was a cause for fear and cowering inside your longhouses. For as Odin and his band of barbarous bacchanalian cutthroats rode across the night sky, banishing the denizens of Helheim to the other world, one must be careful, for if they took step outside of their door during this raucous affair, they knew themselves that they could be whisked away by one of this band of the Wild Hunt and sent to the other world before their time. Now, over the years, this procession, known as the Wild Hunt, would end up gathering different opinions, mostly positive today. But at the time, it was generally considered best to just stay put and stay indoors. Now, with such an introduction, one might be wondering just how in the world could a figure like Odin possibly serve as the inspiration for the figure of Claus or Santa Claus as we know him today. And that's what we're going to discuss in today's video, because folks, this is a question that has long been unanswered by historians, scholars of Germanic cultures, and Christmas fanatics alike, although that claim has been there for many, many years. And I'm not going to try and persuade anyone one way or the other. I'm just going to present the stories and the facts, and at the end of the video, leave you walking away with your own homework to do. Sorry, I know you're going to be getting out on Christmas break soon, but you're going to have homework nonetheless. So, in order to really understand just how Odin could possibly serve as inspiration for the future Father Christmas, we have to go back and study or really compare and contrast the origins, attributes, appearances, and also the night rides that these figures were known to take. And also, we have to go back and look past our modern advertisement-adjusted image of Santa Claus as this jolly old fat man in a red suit. So the origin story of the oldest of the magical beings, Odin, is a rather unique one. If you're not a student of Norse mythology, then it's probably going to weird you out a little bit, but here it goes. So Odin was a son of two primordial giants, Besla and Bor. Alongside of him were his brothers Vili and Ve, with whom they slew the giant Ymir, who was essentially a primordial frost giant born of the frost of the great void Ginnungagap. After they had taken his body apart and created the world, they also created man. And then from there, Odin married Frigg and became the father of many Norse deities. As for the man who would serve as the inspiration for the future Father of Christmas, St. Nicholas, and if you say, I thought St. Nicholas was a fictitious character, in name only when it comes to modern culture. But St. Nicholas was a real man. Don't believe me? Ask the church. Study him. He's an interesting character. But the real St. Nicholas was born on March 15th, 270 AD in the Anatolian seaport Lycia et Pamphylia. Now, unfortunately, like Odin, a lot of the origin and early years of his life is not really known, and what few texts there are about his life and adventures, they were written hundreds of years after he walked on this earth. So, historians kind of view these sources with a little bit of doubt, and they even claim that there was quite a bit of elaboration that took place in regards to St. Nicholas' exploits. And one of which is probably the most elaborate that I've heard, and this was when St. Nicholas resurrected 3 children who were murdered and pickled in brine by a butcher who intended to sell them off as pork during a famine that hit his city. But again, historians cast a lot of doubt on that. I kind of find that hard to believe myself. But aside from that, we do have possibly the most well-known works regarding the life of St. Nicholas, and that is Michael the Archimandrite's Life of St. Nicholas, in which he records all of these different deeds and doings. One of the ones that we can definitely say most closely resembles the Santa Claus figure that he would later inspire is a story of how St. Nicholas saved 3 women from prostitution because the women and their father was very poor. The father could not afford a dowry, which would encourage men to marry these women, so prostitution was the next best thing. But St. Nicholas was not about to abide by this, and so what he did was he went to their home at night and dropped a sack of gold in for 3 nights, one for each of the daughters. And the father used that gold as a dowry and had his daughters married off one by one. But it should be noted that in Michael's works, he mentions how after the second daughter was married off, that the father stayed awake for 2 nights waiting for whoever this gift giver was. And so finally, on the 3rd night, he catches St. Nicholas in the act of what he had done for the first 2 women, dropping a sack of gold in through their window and trying to vanish. But the father caught him and went down to his knees, thanking the man for saving his daughters from what he deemed a fate worse than death. And interestingly enough, like the very Santa Claus that we know of today, St. Nicholas, although he was caught in the act of gift giving, instructed the father not to actually mention anything about this at all. So already there are a few connections that can be made between the Bishop of Myra and this big old jolly old fat man that we know and love today. But that raises the question, and that is, if we look at the kindness and the gift giving of a man who would later become known as the patron saint of toy makers, how in the world could there possibly be a connection strung together between him and the Allfather, Odin? Well, despite Odin's stern, somber, and somewhat intimidating appearance as he walked about the realm of men with his magic spear Gungnir in hand, Odin was actually a very benevolent god, much more so than what we would see in Greek and Roman mythologies. And Odin was very charitable as well, because when we study what he did, we see that first and foremost, he, when creating the world, helped create man, and he bestowed upon them the gift of breath and soul. And then on top of that, he also gifted the magic runes as well as the meat of poetry, and he also, around the time of the Wild Hunt, would gift bags of gold, charmed horse legs, which if you kept them and observed them in their proper respect, then they would actually turn into a bag of gold, or possibly something that you needed more than gold. So nonetheless, we see that Odin, much like St. Nicholas, was actually a very benevolent figure. Now, aside from this, we do have to look at their appearances. And this is one of the main things that a lot of neo-pagans, and I say that with all due respect to any religion, but these neo-pagans today, they try and use this as an argument as to how Odin could not possibly serve as an inspiration for Santa Claus, which they believe is just strictly derived from St. Nicholas, and that is their clothing. Because if you were to see the Lord of Aesir, the Allfather, in the halls of Asgard or in the great hall at Valhalla, then you would see him clad in armor with a great helmet and flanked by his 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin. But you're not going to see him like that all the time, because Odin was typically referred to in Norse mythology as the Wanderer, or the One-Eyed Wanderer, the Gray-Haired Wanderer. And he was known to wander about the realm of men, the realm of Midgard, on many an occasion. And this is where he would typically wear a broad-brimmed hat as well as a cloak, which could be dark blue, gray, or in some cases even black in color. And it's because of this that the neo-pagans, they try and argue, say, well, look at your St. Nicholas, he is wearing red and green, mostly red. And I think what some of them fail to realize is that these are depictions done in later years of St. Nicholas, and they portray him in priestly vestments of that time. But you have to remember that if St. Nicholas was wandering and traveling about, he's not wearing those priestly vestments all the time. And if we actually go forward into history and look at the depictions of Sinterklaas, which is the Dutch name for St. Nicholas or Santa Claus, as we call him today, they typically portray him more in a fashion similar to Odin, which is this tall, rather thin, wizardly-looking fellow with a great gray beard that would almost put Phil Robertson to shame. And they also portray him in different colored cloaks that are varying colors, such as blue, gray, brown, and of course, in some cases, black. But those have been the very rarest of cases that I've been able to find. So there again, we see two attributes lining up together to make up some kind of similarity between these two figures. Of course, when it comes to trying to make the similarity, one of the biggest things that a lot of people always try to go ahead and link the two together with is their night rides. Now, before we dive into that, we have to talk about the reindeer, because everybody knows that Santa Claus, he rides about with his 9 reindeer on his sleigh. However, the interesting fact is that it was not until 1832, when "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" was written, then we see the first mention of Santa Claus as this jolly old man, and he was riding a sleigh pulled by a reindeer. It only mentions 8 reindeer. And this kind of lines up with how Odin, who rode a horse across the night sky during the time of the Wild Hunt, had Sleipnir, 8 legs, 8 reindeer. Similarities start to pile up. And it wasn't until the poem was written in 1939, or the story was written in 1939, about Rudolph, that there was even a 9th reindeer mentioned. And of course, that was later cemented in pop culture, folklore in 1949 by the song sung by Gene Autry about Rudolph. But before that, Santa Claus was not even riding reindeer. Although they knew that at this time, when "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" was written, they knew that reindeer were being used to pull sleighs. The original depictions of this Father Christmas Santa Claus fellow that we all know and love today was actually depicted riding upon a horse, as was Odin. And it's interesting to note, if you want to say, well, yeah, but one's pulling a sleigh, one's horse is pulling, one has the source of reindeer. Sorry, I had a brain fart. One has the reindeer pulling a sleigh, the other has nothing pulling a sleigh, but they both ride horses. That's kind of a flimsy way of going about it. And I say to you this. In the Eddic poem Sigrafumál, it mentions that Odin's horse Sleipnir had magic runes carved upon his teeth, as well as the bridles of his sleigh, which means that although he might not have pulled the sleigh all the time, Sleipnir had to pull a sleigh sometimes. So yet again, we see that there are some connections that could be made. Now, however, I'm getting kind of lost in translation. I'm kind of stumbling a little bit, and I do apologize for that, and I'm a little excited about this particular topic. But we have to look forward past all these different attributes, these comparisons and contrasts that we've made between the two characters, and we have to look towards the night ride. Because as we know, as I've talked about in the Wild Hunt, Odin would come rushing down through Midgard, and he would banish the denizens of Helheim, the evil spirits. What is his reward? Aside from the loyalty, the worship of people at the temples, that's kind of flimsy for a deity, right? Well, you'd be correct. And in fact, people would actually observe this custom that during the time of the Wild Hunt, especially children, they would take their boots and they would leave grass or possible root vegetables, oats, something like that, inside their boots for Sleipnir to come and feast upon when he was hungry. And if Odin stopped by that house and let his horse Sleipnir eat upon the actual gifts that were left out, then he himself would bless the house. Another thing is that the parents would keep this time in reverence, and they would go ahead and leave out ale or mead or pastries upon the table closest to their hearth in order for Odin to come in, visit, and refresh himself, and afterwards he would bless them with good fortune, gold, or whatever you possibly needed for the next year. But this raises a very good question when it comes to bestowing the gifts. Of course, we know Santa Claus comes and gives gifts, and now you know that Odin would come and give gifts. How does one know who is naughty or nice? Who is, because apparently both see you when you're sleeping and they know when you're awake. But who is naughty or nice? Who is worthy of a gift or a lump of coal? And who is worthy of a blessing or a curse? Well, when it comes to Santa Claus, that raises an age-old question that parents have been lying to their kids about for years. And the parents, they typically answer with open-ended answers, and such as, well, magical observation, a parent-Santa connection, or those infernal elves on the shelves. But when it comes to Odin, we have a close-ended answer, and that is, even if Odin did not come down to visit the realm of men, he had his two ravens, Hugin and Munin, which means thought and memory, to fly about throughout the 9 realms throughout the day, and at the end of the day they would land back on his shoulders and they would tell him everything they had seen. So is it just fairly possible that this particular attribute of observation and knowledge with the Allfather would later be translated and watered down to this seemingly omniscient figure of Santa Claus? Is it possible that all these different attributes were combined together from these two magical, mythical figures, and later audiences would cherry pick through them, keeping what they liked and discarding off to the wayside what they didn't really care for? Is it possible that Odin, combined with the actual St. Nicholas, served as the inspiration for the Santa Claus that we all know and love today? Well, viewer, I cannot answer all those questions, but I have been able to present the stories and the facts before you and leave you to come up with your own conclusion. Is Odin Santa Claus? But that concludes today's video. Again, I cannot answer this question, but what I will do is I will encourage you to come along for next week's video titled, Here We Come A-Wassailing. We hope you thoroughly enjoyed today's video. Please continue to follow us on Facebook and YouTube. Your support is greatly noted. As always, if you're following along on Facebook and YouTube, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. If you haven't already, click the bell notification to receive notifications for when we upload. But folks, until next week, this is Isaac White signing off from the Crockett Tavern Museum, saying goodbye and God bless.